There's nothing like some heavy content from a lawyer after lunch. Hello everybody, and it's good to be here with you. My name's John Steenhof. I am distantly related to Peter, and I am the Managing Director of Human Rights Law Alliance, a not-for-profit law firm based in Canberra. I'm building on the exceptional work that was done by my predecessor. You may know him, Martin Isles, and if you've seen him, you know that I am truly a pygmy standing on the shoulders of a giant. When I hear Martin speak, I know that the Bible is right. Wise men do really come from the East. But they also do travel to the promised land in the West. So it is nice to be here amongst all of you again here in Western Australia. I've forgotten what the Bible said about those who return to their hometowns and speak, but I'm pretty sure it always ends out well. The topic of my presentation is a religious freedom primer, or a primer on religious freedom. And I've got a number of slides which require a clicker. So I will see if this works. Which button should I be pressing on this? I have a choice of 4. Very good. So I want to give you a broad primer on religious freedom. I'm going to start my timer now. What it is, why it's important. We don't have enough time to go down any of the really delicious rabbit holes, but we can get adjacent and briefly look at them. I want to talk to you about the origins of religious freedom, the content of religious freedom, the threats to religious freedom, a Religious Discrimination Act, and finally, why should you care, what should you do? Firstly, the origins of religious freedom. Where does religious freedom come from? If you have spent any time in one of the modern thought prisons called universities, you will have been taught that religious freedom is a product of the Enlightenment. The story goes that following the medieval darkness of those dark ages, when the Catholic Church joined the state to compel religious uniformity, that was followed by the Reformation, and the Reformation led to the splintering of the church and to the suppression and persecution of Christians by Christians. This religious battle wages until the 17th century, when a new form of man comes along. A man no longer bound by religious conviction, who understands the superiority of reason over faith. The philosophers of the Enlightenment. And here we have them. So these anti-theists or atheists were the ones who first brought forward the idea of a liberty of conscience. This account portrays religion as inescapably intolerant and prone to violence, and was only saved by those who broke free of its shackles. Is this true? No. I want to show you that religious freedom has a much longer history than that, and we're going to start with the place everybody should start, the Bible. The Bible doesn't speak directly about religious freedom or human rights, but it's very clear when you read through that religion is never compelled, even in the Old Testament. Israel is called through Abraham to be a blessing to the nations. In Deuteronomy 32 verse 8, it's very clear that the Most High gave different nations their different inheritances. He separated the sons of man. He set the boundaries of all people. Joshua, on the cusp of entering the promised land, there he is. Choose this day whom you will serve, God or the idols. Israel, in its nation, in a theocracy, was still commanded to look after the stranger and the sojourner in its midst, as part of its Levitical law. Jeremiah 29, the Israelites in exile are called to seek the peace and prosperity of the city, the godless city in which they live. Jesus teaches, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. Paul on his missionary journeys, preaches, urges, persuades, but never compels. If we go on to see the church fathers, there's a long tradition of church fathers who spoke about religious freedom. In the 3rd century, Tertullian of Carthage here he is. He says, "It is only just and a privilege inherent in human nature that every person should be able to worship according to his own convictions. The religious practice of one person neither harms nor helps another. It is not part of religion to coerce religious practice, for it is by choice and not coercion that we should be led to religion." And so we have this tradition that runs strongly through medieval times. We have Augustine, we have Anselm, we have Aquinas, all talking about the fact that religion should never be compelled and that proper church and state relationship requires religious freedom for all. Moving on to the mighty Reformation. Luther, in his book on secular authority, argues that man-made laws cannot be applied to the human soul and that secular governments should allow humans to determine their own beliefs apart from the threat of the sword. Calvin spoke of the two swords of the civil magistrate and the church. These are separate authorities and distinct and should not be merged. On the other side of the Reformation, Catholics, like the nun Caritas Pirkheimer, drew on the medieval tradition to support the fact that they should have liberty of conscience in the face of some Reformation excesses. Of course, one of the most famous examples is the American Founding Fathers. They had freedom of religion in the First Amendment of the Constitution, no established church, all people free to exercise conscience and at liberty to believe. Certainly, there are plenty of objections. What about the Amalekites in the Old Testament? What God decreed for a small, distinct nation at a certain time in a certain place stands in contrast to what he commanded Abraham in relation to the rest of the world for all time, in all places, to be a blessing. There's Calvin in the execution of Michael Servetius. There's Luther and his famous anti-Semitism. There's, of course, the Americans in slavery. There's no doubt that the expression of religious tolerance has been imperfect and woeful at many times and often blighted by evil. But I think G.K. Chesterton is right, despite being a Catholic and a constant scourge of Calvinists like myself. He said, "It's not that the Christian ideal has not been tried and found wanting, it has been found difficult and left untried." There's Chesterton there. And then we move on to say freedom of religion clearly has Christian origins. It only arises in Western Judeo-Christian countries. It doesn't arise in communist countries, it doesn't arise in Islamic countries, or in other countries the subject of other religions. If you look at this map, it is a map of the Western world. If you overlay on top of that map where religious freedom has been most developed and practiced, it is the same map. So let's move on to the content of religious freedom in 5 minutes. There's a distinctively Christian character to the actual content of religious freedom rights. There are a number of international instruments that have been put together that set out religious freedom rights, but the most prominent is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the best to talk about in the Australian context. And the article of that instrument is Article 18. Let's look at a few features of Article 18 that set out the broad parameters and boundaries. There it is there. Firstly, freedom of religion. This is not just the freedom to believe something privately in your head. It's the freedom to have, adopt a religion and belief of your choice, to manifest that religion, to exercise it individually, but also in community with others, in public or in private, and in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. I have a feeling this clicker does not do much. No coercion. No one shall be coerced or compelled by the sword to take up religion, echoing Tertullian of the 3rd century. Limitations. No right is absolute, but the limitations that are prescribed in international law on religious freedom are at a very high bar. They must be prescribed by law, or they must be absolutely necessary to protect public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. It's necessary to understand the kinds of words used there: necessary, fundamental freedoms. If you're going to contain or try to quash religious rights, you need to have a high bar for any of those limitations. Other key features is that it clearly extends to those exercised in community. So you can form associations with religious purposes, you can prescribe who joins those groups, the conditions of continuing membership, and the conditions for leaving or being excluded. Another great feature of Article 18 is this, and one that's always under threat in progressive cultures, is parental rights. Parents are expressly stated to have the liberty to ensure the religious and moral education of their children in accordance with their own convictions. So, this is a uniquely Christian conception. It allows Christians to live peaceable and quiet lives. It doesn't allow Christians to compel their beliefs on the state and puts in place reasonable limitations. And it doesn't privilege Christians over others. Compare this with the Cairo Declaration of Muslim Human Rights, which has no religious freedom whatsoever, which emphasises the need for strong vilification and blasphemy laws. So it is really quite different from what we talk about as religious freedom, which has a religious origin, a Christian origin, and particular Christian character. This is not something that gets widely acknowledged, and which is relevant when we look at threats in modern Australia to the practice of religious freedom. Threats. What are we seeing in the work we're doing at the HRLA? I'll run you through very quickly. First, threats from supervisory bodies, medical boards, legal practice boards, counselling bodies, teachers' registration boards, adoption agencies. In all of these fields, activists are weaponising complaints procedures, excluding people from occupations, and generally commencing discipline against doctors and other supervised and regulated professions. People who would post their convictions on religion on their personal social media and who would express religious views in casual conversations or workplace conversations are often quashed, suppressed, and have their rights impacted upon. Codes of conduct. Israel Folau. Need I say more? Employment, universities, people are getting in trouble through vague and undefined codes of conduct. This is a way of attacking religious beliefs and shutting down those manifestations in private and in public. Anti-discrimination claims. Christians are being sued for their Christian convictions where they conflict particularly with gender and sexuality ideology. Good case of this is Bernard Gaynor from Queensland, a former soldier who's being pursued in New South Wales by a serial activist in over 30 complaints. So far, none of those complaints have ever been successful against him, and yet they continue. And Bernard has spent over $400,000 of his own personal money defending those claims. We see the binding of conscience, and that's been happening for some time. The example of Dr. Mark Hobart, who was disciplined for refusing to refer a couple who wanted a sex-selective abortion. They were having a daughter, they wanted an abortion. He was hauled up before the medical board for refusing to do so on the grounds of conscience. Just yesterday I was speaking to a pharmacist who's quit her job because she has been threatened with a discrimination claim for refusing female hormones prescription at her pharmacy for a biological male. Hate speech laws, we all know about Archbishop Porteous, who had the cheek and the nerve as a Catholic to write Catholic doctrine in a paper and then circulate it amongst Catholic schools. He should have known that he was going to get in trouble. I mean, that is high risk, isn't it? Defamation actions as well are used to pursue Christians to shut down ideas. Speech is not met with speech. It is met with lawsuits and attacks on people's employment. In academia, it's bad. Josh Lawless was a Christian suspended from university. He answered a simple question amongst his friend group in a casual conversation: what would you do if a friend was gay? He gave a Christian answer. He got suspended. With legal help from one of our allied lawyers, he was reinstated and has finished his degree. But universities have often become worse than communist gulags in terms of freedom of thought. So, what are the solutions? We live in interesting times, and here's where I want to speak about a Religious Discrimination Act. I was speaking to a politician last week who was asking me some tough questions about what Christians should want or not want in a Religious Discrimination Act. I said, give me 5 years and a lot of time to research and I can give you an answer. He said, I've been doing this for 5 years and I still don't have answers. It's a difficult area, but religious freedom is on the agenda in our parliament. The first option could be a Religious Freedom Act, and often seen by Christians as the highest level of protection that we could get. It would enshrine Article 18 of the ICCPR, and it would give a positive right to all of the freedoms that we were just discussing. It would allow courts to either effectively strike down bad law or force it to be constrained to meanings that recognize religious freedom. On reflection, it reminded me of an early 20th century Archbishop of Canterbury, because it's a dangerous idea. He had heard that Anglicans and Methodists had joined together in a service of Holy Communion in East Africa. And he said, it was highly pleasing to the Almighty God, but is never to be done again. In the same way, enshrining Article 18 may be good for Christians, but may leave the door open for a progression towards a Bill of Rights Act, which could be dangerous. Don't believe me, believe Dyson Hayden, who's a former High Court Justice on our Australian court. In a speech earlier this year, he said, the modern Australian judiciary is quite ill-equipped to defend religious freedom. Like most of the legal profession, most modern Australian judges, in their self-perceived sophistication and cultivation, have no knowledge or respect of religion. Some of them detest religion. Their mental view, like that of the rest of their profession, is that like that of the Italian left around 1910. They would spend most of the day in coffee shops or bars, or worse, grumbling about the status quo. At the moment, in jurisdictions without a Bill of Rights Act, they grumble impotently. With a Bill of Rights Act to hand, they have potency. They share the worldview of most of the media, many directors and leading executives of public companies, almost all university teachers and almost all school teachers. But these will not be the views of the rest of the population, and it would be wrong to give the judiciary a monopoly over this field. The dangers of a Religious Freedom Act. There is much to commend the Religious Freedom Act, and I'm not sure that I follow Justice Hayden altogether, but it appears that our government has no appetite and that it's not really an option that's on the table, even though there are many who are pushing for it. So that leads us to a Religious Discrimination Act. At the election, Scott Morrison promised a Religious Discrimination Act. Attorney General Christian Porter is currently working on that act and shopping it around to politicians. And there's much activity in the halls of Parliament on this. Now look, Christians have to be careful here because a bad Religious Discrimination Act could be disastrous. If we narrowly define what religious freedom is, if we make the bar for exemptions too low and don't reflect those which are already in international law, like Haman in the book of Esther, we could make ourselves a gallows on which we get hung. So what do we want? We want robust and clear definition of religious freedom and how that translates into action that will be protected. We want protection for religious organisations, Christians not only individually but in community, just like Article 18 talks about. Christian schools, Christian charities, all of these organisations require protection. We need high boundaries for exemptions that mirror international law, and we need to put very little discretion in the hands of the court. We also need to be making our politicians aware that a Religious Discrimination Act is not a magic pill. It will not solve everything. It needs a wider agenda. We need charities protections for charities that would hold to man-woman marriage. We need rights of parents. That's a massive issue that needs to be addressed and protected. We need to address the low bar on vilification laws, which allows people to pursue Christians when they just feel a little bit hurt or offended. And we need to protect our Christian schools. So in closing, why should you care? And what should you do? Constant vigilance is the price of freedom. There are Christians, and many of you may be in this boat, who think that there are bigger, different, other issues that they should be concerned with. You might have more of a social justice bent, be trying to work in the space of refugees or reaching the poor and the needy. Well, in order to do that, you need to have religious freedom. Religious freedom is the foundation that allows people to be engaged in the public square. So you need to be busy and you need to be constantly vigilant. Number 2, cultural change.
It's very long in coming.
It'll come.
Cultural change. Scott Morrison and his victory is encouraging, but it won't save society. A Religious Freedom Act or a Religious Discrimination Act will not change our culture necessarily. Law sometimes leads culture, but many times culture leads law, and our culture needs to hear the gospel. We need to speak into culture, share the gospel, how we love God and we love our neighbour. And we need to push back against meaningless values. Values are meaningless, relativistic, individualistic statements like diversity, tolerance, inclusion, which have no meaning. Those words, diversity just means lots of stuff. How can you be for or against that? It depends what stuff that is. Instead, we should be going back to a time where we talked about Christian virtues. Okay? And if the slide will allow me, I will go from the multicoloured, beautiful looking values to the severe looking virtues. But that's the black and white world that we should be talking about. Shared virtues with a meaning that can be discussed and debated. We need to have a Christian voice. And here I want to address the clergy because they're the last people whose religious freedoms get attached. Sometimes we have wolves in sheep's clothing. Like that. Sometimes even worse than that is sheep in sheep's clothing. People who don't have the spine to stand up and speak out for what the truth actually is. What we need are shepherds who are willing to lead the flock. A good shepherd leads from the front. It's a butcher who drives the sheep from behind. God's plan for mankind as revealed in the Bible is true, good, and beautiful, not just for Christians, but for everybody. We need to be confident to preach it, speak it, and for our ministers to be leading us as lay people in delivering that message to our community. Finally, head, heart, hands. And this is what I borrow from a good friend of mine, Mark Snedden, who says you need to use your head. Get informed. Sign up to the ACL newsletters, The Truth of It, Family Voice, Voice for Life, Institute for Civil Society, read Eternity News, read some good Christian sources, and learn more about religious freedom. Be conversant in an area where most people don't really have much in the way of knowledge. Heart. Oh, we'll go back. Hey, that's working. Better late than never. Our battle is not against flesh and blood. You deal with real people and not all of them are aggressive activists. So be nice. Be loving, gentle as you engage. Remember this, Christ raged at the clergy and at his fellow Christians, but was gentle with unbelievers. Oftentimes, we reverse that. Don't be a keyboard warrior. Engage knowing that the battle is the Lord's. Engage knowing that our battle is spiritual and that those who we speak to are people in chains. And finally, hands. Get involved. Join an action team. Write to your local MP. Make a visit. I've been encouraged in my role seeing normal everyday people visiting their MPs and talking about the importance of religious freedom. Don't just talk to MPs, talk to your hairdresser. Talk on the sidelines of your sports team. Religious freedom is in the news. It's worth talking about. It may be the only chance you get. Most of all, use your hands for what they're best for, which is praying. We have a great God. He does great things. Spend time praying for those in authority, for the church, for those who we come up against, and pray that God's kingdom will come and that his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And pray that we will get religious freedom that allows us to speak truth of God's kingdom in society. Thank you.